Hello, and a very warm welcome to the National Book Council's Campus Book Festival 2021. You join us today at the Faculty of Arts Library at the University of Malta for an interview with Mark Doty, widely regarded as one of the most vital and arresting voices in contemporary American literature. Mark Doty is the author of more than a dozen collections of poetry, 4 memoirs, and numerous essays and critical works. The astonishing quality and distinction of his writing has been recognized and acclaimed through many prestigious awards, perhaps most notably the T.S. Eliot Prize for the collection My Alexandria in 1995, and the National Book Award for Poetry for Fire in 2008. His most recent work, published only last year, is What is the Grass? Walt Whitman in My Life, a wise and insightful book that presents a sort of congress of 2 poetic sensibilities separated by time, but often perhaps by little else, and sometimes not even by that. One of the signs of its success is that it sends the reader happily back to Leaves of Grass and also back to Mark Doty's own poetry. And we'll turn to this rather revelatory book in more detail later on. In addition to all of these accomplishments, he's also the Distinguished Professor of English and Director of Writers' House at Rutgers University in New York. It's therefore a great honor and privilege to be joined from New York by Mark Doty. Mark, welcome.
Thank you, much appreciated.
Now, originally, as you know, Mark, this interview was due to take place around this time last year, and we were looking forward to welcoming you to Malta in person. COVID-19, of course, put paid to that and to much else besides, and we've all had to adapt accordingly as best we can. And so before getting into discussing specific aspects of your life and work, I'm interested to know how this last year has been for you. What sort of impact has it had on your writing, and also just on your life professionally and personally?
It's been a hard year, as I think it has for everyone, in some ways that are similar and probably in some ways that are different. I basically was isolated between March of last year, when the pandemic became a serious presence here, a widespread presence, and let's see, January, when I started to teach again. And so that felt like a long haul that I wish I could say I was able to use for productive pursuits. I wish I had been able to read extensively and to write deeply, and neither of those really happened. I was terrifically distracted, as I know many are. I think that has to do with how difficult it is to concentrate when you feel the pressure of that kind of uncertainty and doubt. The Manhattan in which I lived became essentially a deserted place. No one was visible on the streets, or very few people. The homeless, those who were afraid to go to shelters, who had no place to go, were the most notable presences. My neighbors vanished, except at 7 o'clock every day when they opened our windows and saluted the first responders. Made noise, played music, beat on pots and pans, and then the windows would close in a few minutes and completely silent again. We're back to being separate from each other. It's been a tough time. I'm lucky that I'm healthy. I've been vaccinated twice. No one I know has suffered or died physically. One of my colleagues at work, most regrettably, a person who had just retired, we lost. But the presence of the pandemic, I think, has shaken us all in a very profound way. And it's going to be a long time before we sort out all that this has meant and all the future impact. Wonderful to see now that everything's changing.
And have you noticed any effect that it's had on the readers of your work? I mean, are they seeking different things from your work? Are they responding in a different way?
I have noticed that in response to the most recent book, What is the Grass, a number of people have said, this was the one book I could read right now. And I think that had something to do with a kind of steadiness and calm in the voice that is actually derived not from me, but from Walt Whitman. In an attempt to be commensurate with his work, to talk about his work, I found myself moving into Whitmanic cadences and Whitmanic stances. And I think that's made a difference for readers. Otherwise, I don't know. You know, it's the strangest thing to have a book come out during a pandemic. The book was published in April. Could not have been worse timing. And of course, that means that I don't get to talk about it with many people. I don't get to travel around the country with the book. People are alone, those who read it, with their responses. And unless they happen to talk to me on social media, I don't know how they responded. So it's a very odd time to publish a book. And it will take some time to figure out what that has meant.
There are certainly shades of the apocalyptic about this pandemic. And that reminds me of a wonderful passage in What is the Grass, where you summon the memory of your East Tennessee grandmother, who, you write, believed this world to be in its final days. I wonder what she would have made of this. But she seems to have been an important early gateway to the joys of literature for you. Is that right?
Very much so. She would take me into her room. We would sit in her big green rocking chair. I'd sit in her lap, and she'd read the Bible to me. I remember it with a great physical vivacity, the texture of the pages, the words of Jesus printed in red, but all the rest of the text was black, her gnarled and spotted hands wrapped around the book, and the sheer feeling of safety, sitting in her lap, surrounded by her arms, the book before us both, and her voice, the lovely East Tennessee cadence, just meeting out St. John the Divine, or whatever it was she was reading that day. And to me, it was my first experience of feeling completely held in a text, beloved, as it were, as if the book itself loved one, wanted you to be there, wanted to take care of you. What she read to me was, of course, in retrospect, completely strange. You know, 4-year-olds are not prepared exactly for the horror of Babylon and the beast ripping fangs rising from the sea and the breaking of the 7 seals, but I loved it. It was sort of a cross between a horror movie, a science fiction epic, and religious vision. Quite remarkable. I enjoyed it very much.
Who else do you think, looking back, besides your grandmother, had a sort of formative impact on you as a reader and perhaps as a writer as well?
I think, let's see. First of all, I think of my teacher, of my 4th grade teacher, Miss Virginia Tynes, who is remembered in a memoir of mine called Firebird. She was the first person I knew who loved the creativity of her students more than anything else, who valued that above all else. So we would often set our math lessons aside and spend the day digging holes in the playground in the sand, making sculptures underground and casting, filling them full of classroom Paris, casting them, covering them. We would gather plants in the desert to boil and make natural dyes for wool, and then do stitcheries or weavings from the wool. Every day was about what we could make and the possibilities of what we might discover by doing so. That was thrilling to me. It had such a kind of forwardness to it, and a faith, I couldn't have said this at the time, but a faith in human possibility. Look what you can do. Look what can be discovered in the world that you can use. That was enormously important to me. And then I would, turn to a poet I met when I was in high school. I was very lucky because I was taking a drama class. We were assigned to perform something we'd written. And I brought a few of the little fledgling poems I was writing when I was 15 or so to the class and performed them. My teacher said, no, it's supposed to be something you wrote. I did. And in order to catch me out as a plagiarist, he showed my work to a poet named Richard Shelton, who taught at the University of Arizona. I lived in Tucson then. And that man took an interest in me, not because the poems were good, but there was maybe a certain precociousness about them. I was reading surrealist poets, and I liked wild, inventive language. So he asked me to come visit him at the university. And when I did, I felt that I was for the first time meeting an adult who centered his life around the practice of art. It was as if poetry were somehow in his spine. He talked about poets of the past as if they were his friends. He gossiped about them. He quoted poetry all the time. It was his center, really. And that was thrilling to me. And I felt that he was holding open the door for a community to me in a way that no one ever had. He said that I could come to the Poetry Center at the university anytime I wanted. I could come to readings. I could hang out there and read. I had tapes of poets reading. The rooms were full of beautiful broadsides and hand-printed versions of poems, photographs of poets. And nothing in my culture valued poetry in that way. It was absolutely thrilling to discover this. And I think I walked to the door of that community and I never looked back.
You felt at home immediately?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Welcomed.
The non-human world has been just as important for you, it seems to me. And this is one of the most striking aspects of your work, I think. And we can talk about the wonderful memoir, Dog Years, and its two canine protagonists, Arden and Bo, who are real characters. But first, I'm interested in the less animate non-human world. Specifically place and environment, perhaps climate as well. Draw us a map, if you would, of the places that have been important to you in your life, particularly as a writer.
Sure. You know, my father was an Army engineer, which meant that we moved very frequently. He would go from one project to another. And I think partly this was in the nature of the job, and partly in that he didn't really get along with people very well, so it was easy for him to be transferred to move on to the next place. We lived in, at least 6 houses before I started first grade, and then moved from Tennessee, which was a whole cultural realm and a linguistic realm in itself, to southern Arizona, where I learned to love the desert along with my mother. We both would go adventuring there and love the desert's colors and its brightness and its sort of vital austerity. And then to Florida, then to California. So many, many moves. And something about that does two things. It makes you believe that whatever you're experiencing now will change, that everything is impermanent. You will always go on to something else. And perhaps in a related way, that everything is worth looking at, that the place around you will reveal things if you pay attention. And they reveal things about themselves, about the particular place you love, but they also reveal things about the observer. So learning to look and to see what you could be taught, how you might be instructed by looking, became important to me, in part because my mother was a painter. And so watching her make landscapes and watching what she did with the materials of her art was a part of the process of observation, of taking things in. So for me, saying what you see became somehow a primary value, that to describe the world as you knew it was a way to locate yourself and know yourself, and perhaps make a marker that would keep something in the face of the impermanence of everything. You know, if you described who you were, if you could name it and say what you saw, then maybe you were able to keep something of it, to retain memory, or to make that landscape part of yourself by turning it into words or visual images, whatever you did. So that habit of description was one that came to me, I think, pretty early as a writer. That means, if you're lucky, that you can put the stamp of self on what you see, because we don't see objectively. We see through our own interests and biases. We see what we somehow love and are interested in, or what we don't like, we see in other ways. So I learned that you could reveal character by looking and by seeing what you see, and that you could involve an audience both in the experience of perceiving and in knowing the person who's doing the perceiving. This was key to me, so what I still do, in a way, I think it's what I always want to do as a writer, is involve the listener, the reader, in the act of perception, so that you're both listening to my perceptions and thinking about and questioning your own.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And lastly, I suppose New York has been the locus aminus for you.
Well, it has been for 20 years now. And when I came to New York, initially living here, I was a guest faculty member at NYU, and the job came with an apartment. And I felt so at home because so many of my friends were here, my publisher, my editors were here. And yet I had known the city only from a distance. And these 20 years have gone very quickly, and they have felt like an immersion in a kind of hive. When you live in a huge city, I think any huge city, you feel closer to the pulse and rush and complexity of human communities. In smaller communities where I lived, I knew individuals. In New York, of course, I do too, but my day-to-day experience is with the crowd, with the large flux of humanity in which you just see everything, and that still is fascinating to me after all this time.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of formative experiences, is it possible for you to give us a sense of what it was like to be an American writer, particularly a gay American writer in the 1980s? which must have been a very fierce crucible to be formed in, as it were. I would imagine that there was a sense of emerging possibility, perhaps something almost Whitman-esque, but then, of course, also the AIDS crisis and the horrible, chilling effect that must have had on any sense of possibility.
I grew up not knowing another gay or lesbian person. I had no idea. I thought that I was the only one. And I think probably there are plenty of men in my generation who felt that way because we were so invisible and there was such a kind of code and conspiracy of silence around it. I went to a high school with 2,000 students, and I had no idea there was anyone there but me, because I later found out that I was entirely wrong, but I had no way of knowing it at the time. That kind of silence makes people sick. It casts your own individual quirk or desire in a huge light. It makes it scary, terrifying. It makes you think that you're ill and that somehow you should be ashamed, you need to be cured. Once I started to come out, of course, I found out that I was part of a much larger community that I knew and that we could talk to each other and the things we had to say. I was married when I was very young, involved in heterosexual marriage when I was 18. That was in part trying to escape from my homosexuality and also trying to find a safe place outside of my family. It took me a number of years to get out of that marriage and to move into a more authentic life. As I did so, there was a great exhilaration. Now I could be who I was. Now I could embrace my life, my desire, and feel validated, feel that I was a part of something and that it mattered, that I had the right to embrace my desire. And that happened pretty much just as the AIDS epidemic was emerging as a real force in American life. As a result, I was very early on in my first sustained relationship with another man writing out of fear, as well as out of exhilaration. And that, in an odd way, suited the kind of temper, the kind of tenor of my childhood we were talking about earlier, that sense that the world could come to an end at any moment. I felt that my love could come to an end, that there was that pressure of mortality, that feeling of evanescence that circled around everything. So the poems that I was writing in the early 80s had to do with that anticipatory grief, with a kind of dread about the possibility of what I might lose. In the later 80s, my partner and I tested. He tested positive and I'm negative about 1988, 89. In those days, we didn't know what those tests meant. The fact that he tested positive didn't necessarily mean he would get sick or die. Maybe we didn't know what to do with it. What we did was to change how we lived. We moved to a more congenial place. We spent time together doing things we really wanted to do. And in fact, he did become ill early in the 90s and died in 1994. That journey, in some way, still feels to me like the very center of my creative life, because everything centered around finding the possibility of love, being able to truly commit and connect to another person, to a life in the world, and then watching that life away. And that, in a way, is a kind of model of all our experience. We will all lose what we love, or we ourselves will be lost. That's the nature of being human. It was not usually something that you would experience at my age. I was 40 when my partner died. But it is indeed a lens through which you can look at all of life. So that experience very much stayed with me as well.
And does that perspective, I know you've spoken at length before about that intersection between desire and loss. Does your perspective on that change as you grow older as a writer?
I think yes, in that I think I'm more grateful for what I have, whatever connection there is. The sheer possibility of love and of pleasure in the present, how marvelous that is. And it's no surprise that loss is attended upon, or there is that possibility always. I think when I was a younger man, it was devastating. It was absolutely unthinkable that the person I loved best could die. It still will be devastating. But I'm in a different position, I'm 67. I'm in a different position towards my own mortality, as well as to the temporality of everything around me. So perhaps I would say that there's a little more of an acceptance. A little more.
As a writer emerging from that context, it would seem to me to be impossible to disentangle the political and the personal, and indeed the political, the personal, and the aesthetic. Were you aware as a writer of having to mediate those different aspects of your life, or was that just the package that came to you?
Oh, I was aware of it, I think very much so. When I began to write about the epidemic, I saw my community so misrepresented in the media. We were described as sexual outlaws. There was a sense that people had asked for it in some way, that their behavior had brought about their illness. Often in the media, what you saw when you saw representations of men living the days were isolated, terribly ill individuals who had little help, few resources. What I saw in my community was entirely different. What I saw were great outpourings of generosity, of care, of love and respect, people working hard to take care of each other. It was really quite a remarkable time. I didn't see that reflected around me. I really wanted to tell those stories so that they might be heard in a different way. There's a limited degree to which poetry can supplant or correct what you read in the news or hear on the television news, but I was going to make sure that those voices, with that perspective, got seen somehow. So I was very grateful to be able to do that. And it was, yes, a political work that had to be done in such a way as to disarm the reader, to be a good enough poem that you would be moved whether you wanted to be or not. If you thought about it, you might not want to be, but you were going to, I hope, have the experience of reading this work through poetry or prose and care about the people who were represented. And that seemed to me an important political action. This came to its height for me when I published Heaven's Post, which is a memoir about my partner's illness and death and the time thereafter, a book about grief. It came out just after, about a year after Previous Interviewers first appeared, and suddenly people with HIV could live much longer lives, perhaps live out a full lifespan. We weren't sure then. And the entire community of caregivers breathed a great sigh of relief and then found themselves completely numb. We had been through so much. We had held up so much. We had carried people through the last parts of their lives again and again and again. We were battered. And so the response to this book was overwhelming to me. When it first came out, I was at a book fair in San Francisco, and after I finished speaking, I looked out, and there was a line of people in the convention center waiting to have their copies of the book signed. It went on and on and on. And there were so many people holding that book with such intensity. There were so many tears. There was so much strong feeling that it was totally overwhelming to me. I was very grateful to be able to help to channel that feeling, and completely uncomfortable about being a spokesperson. It just wasn't what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to be a writer, an artist. I'm not a person who wants to consult with the media or appear on talk shows and talk about that experience. I simply want to make my books and have them do the work they do in the world. So, yeah, it was a daunting time.
Mm-hmm. Your writing is wonderfully descriptive, and you're able to seem to fix on the smallest of details and find the words to make them resonate. And you've written a book, in fact, on the importance of description. This transformation of the everyday reminds me of the history of the American sublime, Harold Bloom's idea of the American sublime, and that Emersonian idea of the near, the common, and the low. Do you see yourself working in that sort of tradition, or in an American tradition at all, in fact?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think that I am a grandson of Walt Whitman's, and himself, a faithful transcendentalist who believes that, you will find instruction. If you go and study the world, you will be rewarded. Emerson said, every object rightly described reveals the faculty of the soul. Mm-hmm. So when we look at things, we see them fully, we see something about ourselves. I truly do believe that. I think there's also an element of standing back from that point of view, and a certain kind of irony about spiritual instruction and the notion that description will save you. It's a little more complicated than that for a 21st century person. But that is the ground of being for me, that notion that to describe, to say what you see, is it worthwhile in itself, and it's a gift to others to do so.
One of the things that you've pointed out there, and you said earlier on, is that description is also, to a degree, a projection of the self. There is subjectivity intermingled with the world in the act of describing. That I see almost as an effect of it's a dramatizing, I suppose, in a way. And I was struck by that word in Dog Years. You refer to dramatizing a few times, and you sort of self-accusingly wonder whether you're too dramatic sometimes. And there's one occasion when you lose a dog as a child, and your parents say, dog shouldn't be for you, and you wonder whether you're too dramatic in your response to the everyday. I would see it as only positive in the effect that it has on your writing, but perhaps you could say more about how you dramatize life.
Sure. Well, that is one of the downsides of that kind of transcendentalist faith, is that it invites us to make the moment of cosmic input. So if I am studying my aging dog, watching him limp go forward, I'm making that into a metaphor for human persistence, for how we contend with time. And that is a useful activity, but I also just need to get him up the stairs. I probably need to get him some meditation so I feel a little better. I need to not worry so much about my own failings with time. So, you can both appreciate the moment and learn from it, but it's also possible to inflate it. And that plays out for me in various ways. I can take this moment as being the predictor of the rest of my life, or I can take this moment as this moment. And so, that's a continuing line to walk. I think, too, that there's just to go back to the transcendentalists for a moment, Whitman and Emerson are looking at a spider web, at a beaver dam, at whatever might be instructing them, did not have doubts that would continue, that phenomena was safe and sturdy and would last in this world. And we understand in our moment that we are not merely, we're not only the students of nature, but we are nature's stewards. That if we don't take care of the world, that instruction will not continue for people after us. In fact, there may not be people after us unless we stand in a different relationship to the natural and our responsibility for it. So this is something new, really. Of course, people thought about apocalypse, expected end times. You hear about that all the time in 19th century literature and spiritual writing, as well as in that of the 20th and 21st centuries. But we have different reality, not so much one coming from above as coming from ourselves in terms of what we can do to this planet. So that's a real change. And I think you can't really, I don't think you can write about the natural world at this moment without, in some way or another, acknowledging that limit and that possibility. Or all I have with nature poetry. I think you don't do that unless you're willing to wrestle with the fact of limit, the fact of danger.
Turning to What is the Grass, your most recent work, could you say something about the genesis of that book and the process of writing it? As I said in the introduction, it is a sort of coming together of two poetic spirits, because you're very much a part of this book. Was that always the plan, or was it inevitable, or did it just emerge as you were writing?
It was always the plan. I knew that I wanted to write a book about Walt Whitman's poetry, because I still continue to think, after a very long time of working on this piece, that poetry is marvelous. There is nothing like it, but the kind of metaphysical ambition which it possesses and its metaphysical successes, the claims it makes, are truly extraordinary. I don't know any poet who wrote his work with the intention of changing people's lives in that way. We express ourselves, we think, well, maybe this might be different to the reader, but his poetry is the product of a mission to transform how his readers see themselves and understand their own lives. it shouldn't work. And it works when it works magnificently. So I wanted to think about that. And I knew that I didn't want ever to write a book that was simply a critical study. Yeah, there's so much of that, so much ink has been spilled about Whitman's poetry. There are shelves and shelves and libraries of books about the writing. I wanted to do something, if I was going to do this, that only I could do, and that would be something about my intersection with this work, the way that I find my life in it, and the way that I've been changed by it, see myself reflected in it. So that I knew I wanted to do, but the problem was how to connect those things. And that took me at least a decade to figure out. Lots of work into this book, not all the time, but writing a little, thinking about it, writing a little more. So it makes it, I think, a fairly unique object, and one that asks the reader's consent to go on this voyage and see what happens as a result of these juxtapositions.
And Whitman is a very personal presence for you. That becomes clear in the book. You said you're a grandson of Whitman, and I suppose in the literary sense, it's easy to see how a whole generation of writers are, stand on the shoulder, or perhaps are perched on the shoulder of Whitman, to use the parrot reference.
Right.
But he's a very, it's more real than that even for you, isn't it? I mean, he's there at various points in your life as a real presence.
Well, yes, and I was startled by that. And of course, there's certain risks in telling your reader that you've seen a ghost or that you feel a presence of the dead. I don't believe that I have seen Walt Whitman's ghost in any traditional sense of that word, but I do believe that he has inscribed his presence in the world through his work in such a way as to make him a living being, in a way, a voice that continues beyond his death to feel just as alive as it ever did. He is uncanny in the way that he goes about insisting to the reader that he's here. He says, "Who touches this touches a man." He says, "I've stopped somewhere waiting for you." He says that he's tired of the paper and ink between us, that he wants to reach through the page and connect. He creates an audience, he anticipates an audience. He had very little of one, especially early in his life when he was writing his greatest poems. But he says he knows that these words are going to reach someone. "I considered long of you before you were ever born." And I believe him when he says those things, that he is attempting to call an audience into being, and has somehow found a way to make a voice that seems just as alive and vital now as it must have been the day those poems were written. The great example is his poem Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, in which he talks about going back and forth on the ferry from Brooklyn to Manhattan. And that journey becomes emblematic of all human journeys in time. And he concerns himself with those who will ride the ferry in the future, men and women of a generation hence. And then he wants to speak to us directly and tells us how he understands what it is to be in time. It's an extraordinary poem. Perhaps, I think it's one of the great poems of his century. And you think, well, this guy living in Brooklyn, self-taught, printer, carpenter, deliberate, really a boho sort of character, writes this book, publishes it himself, maybe sells no copies at all. A year later, publishes his second edition, all full of hope. And in that second edition is this poem, Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, which is one that will change the lives of readers, and which is an undeniable masterwork. It's an extraordinary story.
It certainly is, and that comes through clearly in What is the Grass. But it's not a hagiography either, is it? You draw out some of the tensions and paint a human portrait of Whitman. You're critical of. Sorry, go ahead.
Sometimes I feel a little too worshipful about him, but yes, he was a salesperson. He was very much of his era, in that he was an enthusiastic capitalist who wanted to sell his book, who wanted to be popular, wanted to be loved. And it's a very difficult position to want to be a prophet and a sexual libertarian and to be loved at the same time. It's continually been an issue in American life. We are interested in our prophets, and then we tend to excoriate them rather than elevate them.
That leads me to a rather trivial observation. When I was reading those passages about his attempts at at branding, and also the fact that he wrote reviews for Leaves of Grass, it led me to wonder what sort of poet he would be today, whether he would take advantage of things like Instagram and current technologies, because I can see how he would take to that rather effortlessly.
I think so too. I think he would have liked it, because his goal was to speak in the ear of as many people as possible. That he wanted to be heard. He wanted his message to come across, and he also really wanted company. You sense his feeling of, a kind of profound interior loneliness, and the will to connect as a remedy for that. And certainly, those are means of connecting that we're not able to. I think he would like the internet a lot.
Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, your day job, as it were, is a teacher of poetry. Do you draw on Whitman? I would imagine you do in trying to guide students. And what do students find particularly valuable in your experience when it comes to Whitman?
I have taught Whitman to graduate students, and in truth, I refer to him with my undergraduates, although I have to watch that a little bit, because I'm so obsessed with him that it could be a sort of universal point of reference, and I can wear the listener out with it. I would say I ask them to read him a whole lot, and honestly, the reason is selfish. When you teach something that you like, it's fine, because people can disagree with you, can ask their questions, can criticize, doesn't bother me a bit. When you teach something that you love, you get into risky territory, because if people don't like it, I get defensive, or I want to explain. I want to, not form into their heads. I want you to get why this is wonderful, and so I have to be a little bit careful about that. I've learned over time that it's easier for me if I don't take the poem to the closest to my heart into the classroom.
And who would?
It's good for students to disagree. It's very healthy for them to find their own way and make their own aesthetic judgments, and they don't need a professor who's telling them they're wrong to help in that process.
So, just out of interest, who would that second order of poets be? The poets you love less?
Oh, it's not that I love them less. It's that I don't feel this personal compulsion to defend them in the same way. I can think of any number of my contemporaries, of American poets over the last 50 years, who I teach with great gusto: Phil Corby, Larry Levis, Adrienne Rich, Alice Fulton, many whose work I enjoy. And if the students have issues with them, we can say, that's not the kind of poem that you like. And you say, what is about this that doesn't suit your aesthetic? What is about it that does? It's a very useful conversation. If we try that with Whitman, I'm going to just turn stony-faced and shut down the conversation.
Well, I therefore hesitate to ask this question. One of the great qualities of Whitman that you draw out is his ability to live in and articulate an abundant present. A present moment. And we live in a time where increasingly we are sensitive to some very heavy pasts that we carry culturally, personally. Is there a compatibility there still? Can one serve the other?
Well, yes, one can, and you see this in Saw Myself, which is Whitman's first great poem. And curiously, it's the first poem in the first edition of his book. How many poets can we say this about? The first poem of the first book is one of their masterworks. It's one of his greatest poems. And it's a huge catalog of American life at that moment. It's full of New Yorkers, it's full of people in the countryside, people doing their trades. Whitman wants to look at everybody, and it's hugely inclusive. It contains, there are slaves, there are people who are ill, they're mentally ill, they're physically deformed. All kinds of people are on stage in that poem. And it is remarkably tender, respectful to all people. In that same volume is a poem called I Sing the Body Electric, in which Whitman describes a slave, a black man who is being sold. And he, in an ironic way, assumes the voice of the auctioneer, and he says, look at this man, he's perfect. The blood within his veins, the blood has founded empires. The blood within his veins is exactly the same as yours, you bidders. There is no price you could offer that would be commensurate with his worth. It is, to my mind, one of the great anti-racist poems of the 19th century. So then, about 20 years later, Whitman says some absurdly racist things in prose in a little book called Democratic Vistas. He has a sense to cancel these remarks for the final published edition, but nonetheless they survive and they're just reprehensible. How is that possible? How is it that the person who in his poems could be so embracing of human difference could then later assign on to racist views having to do with the evolution of races, the idea that, of biological determinism, the idea that some races were more evolved than others, crap. And he should have known better. But the visionary Whitman, who wrote the poems, and the day-to-day Whitman, who was involved in conversation and traffic of ideas, weren't quite the same guy. And I guess that's not unusual. It's disheartening, and it's a fact, and I'll try not to work that fact. Am I getting at your question there?
Yeah, that's precisely what I was getting at. And going to that visionary Whitman of the leaves of grass and that spirit of oceanic community and ecstasy and presence. Where do you see, if at all, that spirit today? And I wouldn't necessarily want to limit that question just to literature, just to poetry. Perhaps you see it elsewhere.
I think you see it in. I think it's a common human experience to feel, at least at some point, a part of the whole. That one's life is not a separate, disconnected thing, but part of the tribe, an oceanic, affirmable spirit which continues, a collective being that continues no matter what happens to us individually. I think we all have access to that sort of perception. We don't dwell in it usually, but we go there from time to time. Everyone has experiences, I believe, of feeling that we're not just a limited self in a sack of skin, cut off from the rest, but that we are rightfully a member of a larger entity, and that those forces ebb and flow through us. Or that we could stay there, I guess. Where do we experience that? People experience it in meditation, in sort of sacred circumstances where we feel connected to the whole. We experience it in dance and listening to music, in anything that takes us out of a limited sense of awareness. We experience it in lovemaking. Suddenly, not just me, but you and I are bound collectively. We are without border. And so some of the richest experiences of our lives happen when we lose our borders, basically. And of course, that's also, a definition of becoming psychotic too. But it means that the self is more permeable, less solid than perhaps we're led to believe. And to my mind, there's great consolation, and that's a cure for loneliness and sometimes for a sense of being without purpose or meaning.
Thank you, Mark. A final question. I'm curious as to what you're writing now, and particularly whether you envisage a return to poetry. I think your last published book of poems came out 5 or 6 years ago, Deep Lane, I believe, which is a very a trying book of poems, quite dark in some ways. Are you ready for a return to poetry? Are you returning?
I'm writing poems. I'm not sure how long this project will take me, but Deep Lane is a book that is very much turned inward. As you say, it's a dark book. It's one that refuses the habit of affirmation, which has been so important to me. I think growing up in a difficult family led me as a young poet to feel that my work as a poet was to find what I could affirm, to find ways to embrace experience. And I'm grateful for that, but I also felt it kind of became a habit, which I wanted to break. And so the poems in Deep Lane look right, stare into the dark, basically. So now, because I've written that very personal and very inward-looking book, I have wanted to write poems that are much more social and turned outward. That sounds like a very conscious or deliberate kind of choice, but it isn't really. It's just simply that's where my imagination has turned. So poems that concern themselves with social life, with the inequities of power and of income, with property, which I live in New York City, and real estate is a defining factor of lives here in many ways. So I'm very aware of the lives of the homeless on my block, on my street, and became more so during the pandemic when The only people who were around, the only people you could see, were those who were afraid to go to shelters or having shelter to take. So that has become a very central force in what I'm doing. So these are a group of poems that address that and think about that, try to channel some of the voices of others. And weirdly, I also have this group of love poems that seem like they have nothing to do with that. And so I'm trying to figure out how these parts can talk to each other. But I think in the next year or so, maybe two, this book will get done. It's hard to predict. Poetry moves in a much more mysterious, sort of unpredictable way than prose. You don't finish a prose book unless you just chip away at it all the time. Poetry is another matter. You have to sort of, no matter how much you cultivate the spirit, you have to wait for the spirit to cooperate.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll look forward to that. Mark, thank you very much for your time and for joining us at the Campus Book Festival.
I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks.